Imagine it's 40 degrees Celsius. Your toes are frozen inside your sodden boots. You haven't eaten in 3 days. 20,000 Russian soldiers surround your position. You are only 300 men. Logic dictates surrender. Survival instinct dictates flee. But the commanding general orders, hold on. This is the true story of how 300 Napoleonic soldiers faced the impossible during the retreat from Moscow and survived to tell the tale. November 1812. The Russian winter beat down mercilessly on Napoleon's Grande Armée. Just months before, 600,000 men had marched triumphantly toward Moscow, confident they would defeat Tsar Alexander I within weeks. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had conquered almost all of Europe, seemed invincible, but Russia did not fight like the others. When the French entered Moscow in September, they found a city in flames. The Russians had set their own capital ablaze. There was no food, no adequate shelter, no victory, only ashes. Napoleon waited. He waited for a surrender that never came, and when he finally gave the order to retreat in October, it was too late. The Russian winter is relentless, not only because of the cold, though temperatures did plummet to 35 or 40 degrees Celsius, but because of the lethal combination: extreme cold, devastating hunger, diseases that spread like wildfire, and Russian Cossacks stalking every French detachment like wolves stalking their wounded prey. The retreat became a nightmare. Thousands of horses died. Without horses, the cannons were abandoned. Without cannons, the artillery, the force that had brought Napoleon so many victories, simply vanished into the snow. Soldiers burned their backpacks to keep warm for a few minutes. They ate the leather from their boots when they had nothing left. The weakest sat down in the snow and never rose again. Of the 600,000 who entered Russia, perhaps 100,000 were still alive and fit to fight. The rest, dead, deserters, prisoners, or lost in the vast white expanse. It was in this frigid, apocalyptic landscape that a small French detachment found itself in an impossible situation. General Claude-Étienne Michel commanded a rearguard of roughly 300 men, infantry, a few dismounted cavalry, and artillerymen without cannons. They were survivors, hardened men who had endured the Russian hell and were still breathing. Michel wasn't one of the Empire's great names. He didn't have the fame of Ney, the bravest of the brave, nor the tactical genius of Davout. He was a competent and reliable officer, the kind of man Napoleon put in charge of the rear guard while the famous marshals led the vanguard. But in late November 1812, Michel and his 300 men would receive a mission that would test every last ounce of courage in their exhausted bodies. The main French column had crossed the Berezina River days earlier in a desperate operation that cost thousands of lives. Michel and his men stayed behind, covering the retreat to prevent the Russians from completely massacring what remained of the Grande Armée. Now they were cut off. Ahead, miles of frozen steppe stretching to the French lines. Behind, the Russian army, thirsting for revenge. All around, the winter that killed with the same efficiency as a bullet. A scout came galloping up, his horse staggering, nearly dead from exhaustion. "General, there are thousands of them, maybe 20,000. Infantry, cavalry, artillery. They're less than an hour away." Michel looked at his men. Faces burned by the cold, eyes sunken with hunger, uniforms in tatters. But they were still standing. They were still armed. If you're enjoying this incredible story of bravery against all odds, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other fascinating tales of military history. Michel had to make a decision, and he had minutes to do it. 20,000 Russians approaching, 300 exhausted Frenchmen, 1 hour for contact. What would you do? Michel gathered his officers. 5 men huddled around a makeshift map in the snow, marking positions with stones. "We can try to advance west," suggested an infantry captain. A forced march. Perhaps we'll reach the lines before they completely surround us. It was the obvious choice. It was also suicide. Exhausted men don't undertake a forced march in 40 degrees Celsius weather. They would be overtaken within hours. And on the open, uncovered steppe, 20,000 Russians would annihilate them like a storm annihilates wheat. There's an abandoned village 2 kilometers to the north, another officer said, pointing to a small rise in the terrain. I saw smoke coming out of the chimneys when we passed by yesterday. Michel mentally reviewed the map he had drawn during the weeks of retreat. He knew that village. Small, maybe 30 or 40 buildings made of wood and stone. A well in the center, a low fence around it. Defensively, it was mediocre. Any instructor at the military academy would tell him not to dig in there. But Michel wasn't thinking about defending himself. He was thinking about surviving. Let's go to the village, he ordered. Half an hour to get there, half an hour to get ready. That's all we have. The men set off. They weren't running. Running in deep snow with military gear is impossible. But they marched with a steady stride, with the heavy gait of veteran soldiers who know every minute counts. They reached the village 25 minutes later. It was completely deserted. The inhabitants had fled weeks before, when the war came too close. Michel organized the defense with the efficiency of years of campaigning. First priority, fire. I want a bonfire in every house we aren't using as a defensive position. We need to thaw these men out before they fight. The soldiers rushed to the scene, smashing furniture and using any available firewood. Within minutes, smoke was billowing from a dozen chimneys. Second priority, water. Fill all the canteens. If we're surrounded, we won't be able to get to the well. The men took turns at the well, breaking through the ice and scooping out buckets of icy water. Third priority, ammunition. I want to know exactly how many rounds we have. The report was devastating. An average of 30 rounds per man, perhaps 9,000 rounds in total, against 20,000 enemies. The calculation was grim. Every French bullet had to be counted 3 times. Michel positioned his men in the houses around the perimeter. Windows became firing positions. Doorways were barricaded with whatever was available. Tables, beds, tree trunks. The best marksmen took up positions on the rooftops, where the height would give them an advantage in the opening moments of the battle. The dismounted cavalry, some 40 men who had lost their horses but still carried their sabers, was held in reserve near the center of the village. If the Russians managed to break through the perimeter, they would form the last line of defense. Then Michel did something unexpected. He ordered a French flag, the blue, white, and red tricolor, to be raised on the tallest flagpole in the village. "General," protested a captain, "that will draw attention." "Exactly," replied Michel. "I want them to see us. I want them to know we're here, that we're not running away." It was a basic but powerful tactic of military psychology. Fleeing troops are easy prey, terrified, disorganized men who think only of escape. But troops in position, ready to fight with a flag raised, that would shame even the most confident enemy. Capturing them would cost lives, and even an army of 20,000 men prefers easy victories. The French waited. Some ate their last rations, pieces of stale bread, dry meat that tasted more like wood. Others simply warmed themselves by the fire, knowing it might be the last time they felt warmth. A young soldier, no more than 19 years old, began to weep silently. A veteran beside him placed his hand on his shoulder. "First battle?" "No, sir. I fought at Borodino, at Smolensk. But at 20,000... "Then you've killed Russians before," the veteran said simply. "Today is no different, only there are more targets. But you hold the rifle steady, aim at the center of the group, pull the trigger. That's all. One shot at a time." The young man nodded, wiped his tears, and checked his weapon. A shout from the lookout on the rooftop. "Move east!" Everyone froze, not from the cold, but from the tension. Michael climbed to the highest roof and raised his telescope. On the horizon, Rising like a dark tide against the white snow appeared the Russian army. It wasn't disorganized. It wasn't a horde. It was professional, disciplined, columns of infantry marching in formation, squadrons of cavalry on the flanks, cannons pulled by pairs of horses, 20,000 men, maybe more. Michel closed the telescope, descended, and calmly walked to the center of the village where everyone could see him. "Gentlemen," his voice echoed in the icy silence, "you crossed Russia. You survived. What killed 500,000 men? You didn't come here to die." Pause. "Today we will show the Russians why the Emperor conquered Europe. We will show them why our regiments bear names written in gold, not for numbers, but for bravery." Another pause. Then, in a softer, almost paternal voice, "Let every shot count. Stay calm. And when this is over, we will have a story our grandchildren won't believe." A murmur of approval rippled through the ranks. Michael returned to his position. The Russians were 800 meters away, 700 meters, 500 meters. At 300 meters, the Russian army halted. A mounted officer advanced alone, carrying a white truce flag. Michael left the village with his officer. They met halfway. The Russian officer was a colonel, with a black beard covered in frost and a hard gaze, like that of a steppe dweller. He spoke French with a marked but understandable accent. Many Russian officers of the aristocracy were fluent in the language. "French general," he began bluntly, "I am Colonel Andrei Volkonsky. I command the vanguard of General Miloradovich's Free Corps. You are surrounded. Your men are exhausted, freezing, and starving." Michel didn't reply. He simply waited. Volkonsky continued, "I have ordered my artillery into position. In 1 hour, we will have 20 cannons aimed at this village. I can reduce it to rubble without losing a single man." True. Michel knew it. "I surrender now." Volkonsky paused, softening his tone slightly. "And I guarantee humane treatment as prisoners of war, hot food, shelter, medical care. Your war is over, General. It need not be your grave as well." It was a reasonable offer, generous even by Napoleonic standards. Michel was silent for a long time as the wind howled between them, carrying snow that pricked like needles. Then he replied, each word carefully chosen. "Colonel Volkonsky, I appreciate the offer, but I have 2 observations." "Go ahead." "First, if it were so easy to destroy us with artillery, you wouldn't be here. Surrendering. You know that even surrounded, we can inflict hundreds of casualties before falling. And your general refuses to explain to the Tsar why he lost so many men to eliminate 300 French soldiers when Napoleon's real army is still fleeing west." Volkonsky didn't contradict him. Michel was right. "Second observation," Michel continued, his voice growing harsher. "I will return to that village, not as a prisoner, as a commander. And when your men advance, because you will be forced to attack, they will discover that the French don't fight well only when they win. We fight best when we have nothing to lose." The 2 officers stared at each other, professionals recognizing professionals. "You're making a mistake," Volkonsky said. "Perhaps," Michel replied, "but it will be my mistake, not my enemy's." They saluted each other formally. After all, war had its rules, and returned to their respective lines. Back in the village, Michel didn't need to explain. His men had seen the impalet. They had seen the general return alone. They knew what it meant. "Did you refuse?" a captain asked. "I refused. No protest, no panic, just silent acceptance." They were soldiers of the Grande Armée. They had marched under Napoleon across Europe. They knew that some battles you choose, others choose you. This one had chosen them. "Calculation?" another officer asked. Michel looked out the window at the Russian army taking up positions. "The first wave will be heavy infantry. They'll test our defenses, look for weak points, maybe 2,000 men." He paused to do some mental calculations. "If we repel the first, the second will come. Heavier, maybe 5,000, with cavalry trying to break through a flank. And if we repel the second, Artillery, Michel replied simply. They'll bombard until there's not a stone left standing. Then they'll send in the rest, and there won't be a third line of defense. A deathly silence. Then we'll have two chances, the captain said finally. Two, Michel. Agreed. From the rooftops, French observers reported the enemy movements, infantry forming attack columns, cavalry splitting into the north and south flanks, artillery taking up positions at 600 meters. Count 16, 18, 20 cannons. Michel made the final adjustments. He moved 10 men to reinforce the northern flank, where the terrain was slightly more open. He ordered the snipers on the rooftops to concentrate on the Russian officers. Killing the high command would disrupt any attack. Save ammunition was his only order. First shot at 100 meters, not before. 100 meters, deadly close. But at that distance, even smoothbore muskets were lethal, and every bullet had to be crucial. In every battle, between the preparations and the start of combat, there is a moment when time seems to stand still. The Russians had finished their positions. Columns of infantry stood motionless, awaiting orders. The cavalry flanked, their horses trotting nervously. The artillery was loaded, the cannons aimed. In the village, 300 French soldiers waited, rifles ready, bayonets fixed, cartridges within reach. The wind had died down. The snow fell softly. Everything seemed suspended. A French soldier murmured a prayer. Another kissed a medallion with his wife's portrait. A third, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his face expressionless, mentally preparing himself for the hell that was about to unfold. And then, like thunder shattering the silence, boom! A Russian cannon. Fired, not to show off but as a signal. Immediately the drums began to pound. The sound reverberated across the steppe, that ominous, inescapable rhythm of advancing infantry. Hurrah! 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 The Russian war cry. Thousands of throats shouting in unison. 2,000 men advanced. They didn't run. Disciplined march, rifles with fixed bayonets, officers at the front with drawn sabres. "Hold your positions!" shouted Michel. "Not a single shot until I give the order." 150 meters, the shoom. French could now make out faces. Determined expressions, beards covered in ice, grey uniforms contrasting with the snow. 120 meters, hands gripped rifles, fingers on triggers, but discipline held. 100 meters. Fire! Michel's order echoed through the air. A salvo of 300 rifles erupted simultaneously. The first line of Russians vanished, simply vanished. As if a giant hand had swept them away, men fell everywhere, dead, wounded, felled by the impact. The advance stalled. "Reload! Reload!" Expert. Hands moved with the precision of military repetition, pouring the powder, inserting the bullet and wad, tamping it down, setting the primer in the loop, rifle ready. 30 seconds. The veterans did it in 25. The Russians had recovered. They reorganized ranks over the bodies of the fallen. They advanced again. 70 meters. Fire! Another salvo. More men fell, but the Russians pressed on. That was what made them lethal, not just their numbers, but their brutal determination. They suffered casualties and kept advancing. 50 meters. Now it was indiscriminate gunfire. Every man fired as soon as he reloaded. The noise was deafening. Gunpowder explosions, the cries of the wounded, officers barking orders that no one could hear. 30 meters. The Russians reached the first houses on the perimeter. Barricaded doors were rammed with rifle butts. Windows became scenes of hand-to-hand combat. Bayonets thrust through the cracks, men shouting in French and Russian. Michel fired point-blank at a Russian soldier who had entered through a window. He drew his second pistol and fired again. All around him, the chaos of hand-to-hand combat. There were no more formations, only individual violence multiplied hundreds of times. A French soldier blocked a Russian bayonet with his rifle, turned and struck the attacker in the face with the butt of the rifle. The Russian fell. Another immediately took his place. On the rooftop, a French sniper fired 6 times in a minute, a personal record, taking down 3 Russian officers before a Russian bullet struck him in the shoulder. He staggered, but kept firing. For 15 minutes, an eternity in combat, the Russian attack continued. Then, gradually, it began to fall back. It wasn't an organized retreat. It was the natural dissolution of an attack that had lost momentum. Too many casualties. Too much unexpected resistance. Courage has its limits. The Russians stumbled back, dragging the wounded and leaving the dead behind. In the village, a stunned silence. Michel did a quick head count. They had lost 40 men, killed or so badly wounded that they couldn't fight anymore. That left 260. Ammunition, an average of 20 rounds per man, maybe 5,000 bullets in total. He peered through the smoke at the Russian lines. They were regrouping. The second wave was forming, and this time it would be bigger. 20 minutes of calm, maybe less. Michel made the most of every second. Collect the ammunition from the dead, ours and theirs. The soldiers crawled among the bodies, emptying their cartridge belts. The calculation was brutal but necessary. A dead man doesn't need bullets. A living man does. Water! Someone brought water. A young soldier ran between the positions with a bucket, offering cartridges to the men whose throats were raw from shouting orders and coughing up gunpowder smoke. Wounded, to the center! Those who could be saved were dragged to the largest house in the center of the village, where a makeshift surgeon worked with instruments sterilized in brandy, the only anesthetic available. The screams shattered the calm. Michel inspected the defenses. 2 houses on the northern perimeter were partially destroyed, their walls cracked by axe blows and rifle butts. He ordered them abandoned and the men repositioned in sturdier buildings behind them, less perimeter to defend, fewer men to defend it. The tally was balanced, but only just. A captain approached, his face covered in gunpowder and blood. He couldn't tell if it was his own or someone else's. General, casualty count. Tell me. 42 dead, 18 seriously wounded, unfit for combat, 31 slightly wounded, still in position. Cold numbers. Lives that had been brought to life just minutes before. Total active force. 229 fit for combat, sir. From 300 to 229 in 15 minutes. And the second wave would double the first. Michel gazed at the horizon. The Russians weren't just regrouping, they were tactically reorganizing. The first wave had been a test, probing the defenses, identifying weak points, gauging the resistance. Now they knew. They knew the French had ammunition. They knew where the fortified positions were. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they also knew it was possible. How long do you estimate? He asked the captain. 15 minutes, maybe 10. Michel nodded. He gathered his officers one last time. There was no map, no more elaborate plans, only stark reality. Gentlemen, the next wave will either annihilate us or push us back. There will be no middle ground. He looked each man in the eye. Concentrate your fire on the center of the formations. Ignore the flanks until they are 50 meters away. I want the center column destroyed before it reaches our lines. It was a basic but effective tactic. Concentrating fire creates killing zones. Even a considerable numerical advantage falters before such a concentration of fire. Dismounted cavalry, he said, addressing the commander of the 40 saber-wielding men. When, not if, they break through the perimeter, you will be the last bastion. Let nothing through. The cavalry officer, a lieutenant with a scar across his face, simply nodded. No words were needed. Everyone knew what last stand meant. It meant dying on the spot. One last thing, Michel said, lowering his voice. If I fall, Captain Renaud takes command. If Renaud falls, Lieutenant Marchand. If Marchand falls... He paused, a bitter smile on his face. Well, if we get this far, command probably won't matter anymore. Tense laughter, dark humor typical of soldiers. But then Michel's tone changed completely. He became serious, almost reverent. You are the finest men I have ever had the honor of commanding. Not because you are invincible, but because when the impossible confronted you, you did not turn away. History will remember this town. It will remember 300 Frenchmen who said no to fate. Silence. Then, one by one, the officers saluted. Not the formal parade salute, but the slow, deliberate salute of men who know they are facing something greater than themselves. They returned to their positions. From the rooftop, the shout, "Move! Attack formation!" Michel climbed back up. He raised his telescope. He felt a chill, and not from the cold. 5,000 men, maybe more. 3 enormous columns advancing in parallel, the cavalry on the flanks ready to exploit any gap. And behind, visible in the rear, the artillery adjusting its position. "My God!" murmured the lookout. Beside him, Michel lowered the telescope. "No," he said calmly, "today we won't have God. We'll only have each other, and that will have to be enough." He descended, slowly traversing the defensive perimeter. He didn't shout orders. He didn't give speeches. He simply walked through each position, looked each man in the eye, touched some shoulders, nodded to others. Presence. Leadership isn't always expressed with words. Sometimes it's enough to be present, visible, serene, when everything is falling apart. The men stood firm. They checked their weapons. They adjusted their positions. They waited. The sound of Russian drums echoed again. Now louder. More drums. More men. "Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah!" 3 columns began to advance. This time there were no tentative steps, no tactical probes. It was brute force, thousands of men advancing to crush hundreds. Michel let them close. 150 meters. Not yet. 120 meters. Not yet. He needed every shot to count double. 100 meters. First range. Fire! Half the French opened fire. The volley ripped through the center column. Second range. Fire! The other half opened fire while the first reloaded. It was the rotating fire system that had made Napoleon's infantry so lethal. Always half firing, the other half reloading, a constant barrage. The Russian columns were reeling. The central column especially was being torn apart by concentrated fire, but the flanks kept advancing, 80 meters. Fire at full rate! Now it was pure volume of fire. Every man was firing as fast as he could reload. The gunpowder smoke became so thick they could barely see their targets. They were firing toward the screams, toward the figures in the greyish haze. 60 meters. Russian bullets began to strike the French defenses with lethal frequency. Men were falling from windows, from rooftops. A sniper fell from a roof. A bullet through his chest, rolled 3 meters, and didn't move again. 50 meters. The central column had halted. It literally could not advance any further over the pile of dead and wounded. But the flanking columns were intact. They were coming from the sides, just as Michel had predicted. "Cavalry to the southern flank! Reinforce the south!" The 40 men with sabres charged, their boots slipping on the blood-soaked snow. 40 meters. Michel fired both pistols, dropped them empty, picked up a musket from a dead soldier beside him, fired, dropped it, picked up another. There was no time to reload. He only collected the loaded weapons from the men who no longer needed them. 30 meters. The southern column reached the perimeter. The dismounted cavalry met them with cold steel. Sabres against bayonets. Savage howls. Blood on the snow. In the north, the second column had also reached the houses, fighting house by house, each room a battle. The French retreated from room to room, fighting for every meter. A French soldier, out of ammunition, used his musket as a club, beating the Russians who entered through. The window. He received 3 stab wounds but killed 2 before falling. In the center of the village, the surgeon took a pistol and shot a Russian who had reached the house of the wounded. The wounded who could move grabbed whatever they could find, knives, medical instruments, pieces of wood, and fought from their beds. Michel found himself caught in the chaos, with 5 Russians between him and his men. There was no time to think. He drew the saber he had carried for 20 years of campaigning. He blocked a bayonet, severed an attacker's arm, whirled around, and stabbed another in the neck. He was struck in the back with a rifle butt that knocked him to his knees. He rolled, slashed a Russian's legs, and staggered to his feet. A Russian officer advanced with his saber. At last, a proper duel amidst the carnage. 3 exchanges of blows. Michael was older, but more experienced. He feinted a high attack, struck low, and his saber landed in the Russian's abdomen. The march proceeded in silence. No one spoke, no one sang. The French usually sang on marches, a custom that kept morale high. But not that day. Michel's men were exhausted, hungry, and cold. They were in an almost transcendental state, where their bodies kept moving because stopping meant death, but their minds were elsewhere. Dulac positioned his cavalry as a rearguard, watching for Russian pursuit. But they didn't pursue. Perhaps they had decided that this small detachment had cost too many lives. Or perhaps they had bigger objectives. Napoleon's main column was still to the west, vulnerable, trying to reach the Polish border. They marched for 4 hours. When they finally stopped to rest, it was almost nightfall. Dulac ordered fires to be lit. Small, controlled fires, but enough to warm Michel's men. Rations were distributed. There weren't many. The Grande Armée had almost run out of supplies. But it was hot food. Watery pea soup, stale bread, a little salted meat. For men who had gone days. Without eating much, it was a feast. Michel sat apart from the group, alone, staring into the flames. Dulac approached and sat beside him without asking permission. "Do you want to talk about it?" Silence. Then, slowly, "I lost 188 men in 2 hours. Men who trusted me, who followed my orders even when those orders pitted them against 20,000 Russians. You saved them," Dulac said quietly. 112 men are alive because you made the right decisions, and 188 died because of the same decisions." "No," Dulac corrected, his voice firm. 188 would have died anyway. All 300 would have died. If they had tried to escape across the steppe, the Russians would have chased them down. If they had surrendered, half would have frozen to death as prisoners before they even reached a camp. Dulac continued. "You did the impossible. You held off 20,000 Russians long enough for help to arrive. And now 112 men will see their families again. 112 men will tell this story to their children. This is not a failure, General. It is a miracle." Michel finally looked at him. "It doesn't seem like a miracle. It never does, not to those who have lived through it." They stood in silence for a while, watching the dance of the fire. Finally, Dulac stood up. "Rest, General. Tomorrow we march again. We still have 200 kilometers to the border, and winter isn't over yet." Michel nodded. Dulac left. But before going to sleep, Michel did something he hadn't done in years. He knelt in the snow, clasped his hands, and prayed. Not for himself. For the 188 who would not return, for the names he would memorize and carry with him for the rest of his life, for the survivor's guilt that every commander who loses men knows intimately. The night was long and cold, but at dawn the column resumed its march. 5 more days of marching, 3 Cossack ambushes that were repelled, 2 blizzards that killed more men than Russian bullets, and finally, on the afternoon of the 6th day, they crossed into Polish territory. It wasn't a triumph. There were no celebrations, only profound relief. On the Polish side of the border, a supply detachment was setting up depots for the remnants of the Grande Armée, who were still trickling in. Michel and his men were sent to a makeshift camp, canvas tents, large fires, and, for the first time in weeks, decent food. The men ate in silence. Some wept. Others simply slept where they fell, not even bothering to go into the tents. A supply officer approached Michel with a folder. "General, I need a report for the official record. Now, orders from Marshal Ney. All units must report on strength and casualties." Michel sighed. "Unit 2 Corps Rearguard Detachment. Initial strength 300 men. Current strength 112 combat fit, 37 wounded recovering. Status Operational. The officer took notes mechanically. Combat? 1. Enemy strength? Michel hesitated. Then he simply said, superior. The officer looked up. How superior? Enough. The officer understood he wouldn't get any more details. He nodded, finished writing, and left. But the story of Michel and his 300 did not go unspoken. Soldiers talk, especially about feats that defy logic. Within days, the story had spread throughout what remained of the Grande Armée. 300 Frenchmen holding off 20,000 Russians. An unnamed village transformed into an unlikely fortress. A general who refused to surrender when surrender was the obvious choice. The stories grew as they were passed from mouth to mouth, as they always do. Some said there were 30,000 Russians, others that Michel had personally fought with 100 men. The truth was impressive enough, but legend needs embellishment. 2 weeks later, Michel was summoned to Napoleon's headquarters in Vilnius. The emperor was somber, visibly aged by the Russian catastrophe. Of 600,000 men, perhaps only 40,000 had survived, and many of them were maimed, sick, or battered. But when Michael entered the room, Napoleon stood. General Michel, Your Majesty, I have heard of your rearguard action. It was my duty, Your Majesty. Napoleon walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his classic posture of deep reflection. Duty, he repeated. Yes, but duty is one thing, and the impossible is another. You accomplished the latter. He turned and looked directly at Michel. This campaign was a disaster. I lost an army. Perhaps I lost the empire. Time will tell. But amidst the disaster, there were moments of such bravery that they remind me why we conquered Europe. Your moment was one of them. Michel was speechless. Napoleon continued, I am promoting you to Major General, and when we rebuild the army, and we will, I want you to command a brigade. Men like you are rarer than gold, Michel saluted. It is an honor, Your Majesty. No, Napoleon corrected. The honor is mine, to have such officers serving under my banner. Michel left headquarters in a daze. Promotion, recognition, from the Emperor himself. He should have been euphoric, but he felt only emptiness, because 188 men weren't there to share the honor. He returned to the camp, where his 112 survivors were. They had been regrouped, given new uniforms and proper equipment. They looked like soldiers again, not starving ghosts. When Michel arrived, they automatically began to form ranks. Rest, he said. I haven't come to inspect. He sat down on a log near the central fire. The men slowly gathered around him. The Emperor promoted me, he said simply, silent applause, and recommended that the unit receive a collective commendation for gallantry. More applause, a little more enthusiastic. But, Michel raised his hand, silencing them, there is something more important than military honors. There is memory. A pause. When we go home, and we will, I want each of you to remember the names. The 188 who didn't return, not just as numbers, as men, because they deserve more than statistics in an official report. They nodded silently. A senior soldier with 3 veteran stripes on his arm stood up. General, with your permission, he spoke. The men wanted to do something for the fallen. We thought, perhaps make a list, all the names, so they wouldn't be forgotten. Michel nodded slowly. Go ahead, and when you're finished, I want a copy. I'll carry it with me, always. They spent the next few hours doing just that. Each survivor contributed the names they remembered. They discussed among themselves to confirm the spellings, the ranks, the regiments they came from. In the end, they had a complete list, 188 names. They weren't numbers. They were Pierre Dumont, rifleman of the 5th Line, Jean-Baptiste Moreau, dismounted cavalryman, François Dubois, gunner without a cannon, Henri Lefebvre, drummer who wielded a musket when necessary. The list was copied by hand onto thin paper. Michel carefully folded his copy and kept it in the inside pocket of his uniform, close to his heart. He carried it with him for 43 years. When he died in 1855, at the age of 71, it was still there, yellowed and worn, but well preserved. It was buried with him, according to the specific instructions in his will. The 1 to 12 survivors dispersed when the war finally ended in 1815. Some returned to farms, others to shops or workshops. Few remained in the reorganized Restoration Army, but all of them preserved the story, and they told it to their children, grandchildren, to anyone who would listen. Over time, the story became embellished. It became legend. 300 against 20,000 in the Russian snow, the nameless village that refused to fall, the general who defied fate. Some details were lost, others were invented, but the essence remained. Extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. Modern historians debate the exact numbers. Some suggest there were only 8,000 Russians, not 20,000. Others that the French numbered 400, not 300. The documents from the time are incomplete. The Russian campaign was so chaotic that many records simply don't exist. But the core of the story is verifiable. There was an isolated rearguard detachment. There was a desperate defense of a nameless village. There were disproportionate casualties, and there were enough survivors to tell the tale. That's what matters. In 1912, on the centenary of the Russian campaign, French historians attempted to pinpoint the exact village. Using period maps, survivor accounts, and analysis of march routes, they narrowed the search down to 3 possible locations in the western region of present-day Belarus. An expedition was organized. They found an abandoned village that matched the descriptions: ruined wooden houses, dry wells, and upon excavating, they unearthed musket balls, buttons from French and Russian uniforms, fragments of military equipment, and, buried in a mass grave on the outskirts, the remains of hundreds of men. They couldn't determine for sure if it was the right village. Dozens of small battles had been fought. During the retreat and in dozens of French and Russian villages, soldiers had fought and died. Even so, they erected a monument, a simple stone plaque. Here or near here in November 1812, soldiers of the Grande Armée defended the impossible. May their courage not be forgotten. The monument is still there, on a little used country road. Few tourists visit it, but sometimes locals leave flowers, because even when names are forgotten, courage echoes through the centuries. The story of Michel and his 300 is not unique. In every war, there are moments when a small group faces overwhelming numerical superiority and, against all odds, survives or wins. Sparta had its 300 at Thermopylae. Rome had its legions besieging Alesia. Britain had the Battle of Rorke's Drift. France had its nameless village in 1812. These moments don't matter because they changed the course of wars. They generally didn't. The Russian campaign remained a disaster. Napoleon lost 560,000 men. The empire began its final collapse. But they matter because they demonstrate something fundamental about the human spirit, that when all seems lost, when logic dictates surrender, when statistics say victory is impossible, there is still a choice. The choice to fight, to resist, to say no. Michel and his men chose to fight. 188 paid the ultimate price. 112 survived to tell their stories. And now you know the story too. 300 Napoleonic soldiers against 20,000 Russians. Frozen, starving, surrounded, but they never surrendered. If this story of extraordinary courage has impressed you, subscribe to the channel. We have dozens of incredible tales of military history waiting for you. Next week, we'll talk about another impossible moment. How 100 Britons withstood an attack by 4,000 Zulus at Rorke's Drift. Until then, remember, history isn't just about empires and emperors. It's about moments when ordinary people did extraordinary things, and those moments deserve to be remembered. Thanks for watching, and never forget, courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to fight despite it.